I first saw Barry, this is Barry Jendebar, and am I saying it correctly?
Jendebar.
Jendebar. And I first saw him speak about his book at my yarn shop in York. And I was telling some other folks that the owner of the shop is a real book reader, and everyone that goes there seems to be also. So we love that we try and support her when she has Maine authors come in and speak. She should be a librarian, but she does a great yarn shop, so I'm really happy. But what I loved about Barry's talk was the process he uses in writing his books and his ideas and how things formulate. It wasn't just talking about his book, and I don't know what your talk is going to be about tonight. I do know we spoke about At the Hands of Others, his novel. And our book group has been circulating the book, and we've all been reading it. And I haven't had a chance to meet up with everyone, so this is really a wonderful opportunity for some of us to hear you talk about this book. I think you'll really enjoy it. Barry, as I said, has been here over 50 years. He writes from Kingfield Cottage in Ogunquit, Maine, and Cobb's Farm Cabin in Bartlett, New Hampshire. I think those two, I've never been to either, but they sound like a perfect place to write a story. So I don't want to take any time away from your talk except for one thing. Next Tuesday's voting day in Berwick, and I just wanted to put a plug in to vote. Go to the polls, vote. The library's on the docket. You can show your support for great programming like we have tonight by putting a plug in and voting for the library. Without further ado, Barry Jendebar.
Well, as Sharon said, I'm Barry Jendebar, and I do write from Kingfield Cottage in Ogunquit. I've lived there, I think, 52 years. And she's right that in Maine, you know, it doesn't matter how long I've been there. I wasn't born in Maine, so I'm still from away. But I've always found that both in my writing and in my associations and in business, that if you embrace Maine, it pretty much embraces you, and you can become a part of it. And I've done that. I've lived in the same house for 47 years, so raised my daughters there. And I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Sharon and the Berwick Public Library for inviting me. Tell you a little bit about myself and how I got to be sitting here. I've been writing for a long time, and on different levels. My focus gradually shifted and evolved as I traded my youth for wisdom, or at least some of it, or some wisdom. My wife and I raised 2 daughters. We paid down our mortgages and funded 3 college degrees, my own being earned while my daughters were in college. I graduated from the University of Southern Maine. I returned to college when I was 48, and I took English courses basically as a hobby. And I just kept accumulating them, and professor, who were pretty much my contemporaries at that point, said, well, what are you doing? So I put it together and found out what core courses I was missing, and I ended up graduating with honors in English. And finally, you know, I was a contractor. I was a remodeling contractor, still am. And after my emancipation from the slavery of debt, I was able to start focusing more on my writing. In the 60s, I wrote poetry. A little bit of sort of war-oriented stuff. Vietnam War was going on. And I wrote essays and some op-ed pieces sometimes to fill the gaps. I was fortunate to have a friendship with May Sarton, who was a writer from Peterborough, New Hampshire, and lived over in York until she died over there. She was affiliated with Mary Lee Smart, if any of you knew Mary Lee. And I was doing something at her house one time, and she said to me in her sort of, she had sort of an adopted English accent. She says, "Are you still writing those short stories?" And I said that I was. She says, "You've got to stop writing short stories." She says, "There's no room to make mistakes. Write novels, there's plenty of time." So it was interesting advice, and I took it, and I've been happily making mistakes ever since. When my publisher introduced me at the release event for At the Hands of Others, he said, well, when Barry published his first book, people said, oh, that's nice, that's kind of cute. And then I published my second book, and people said, this is him introducing me. And then now he's published a third book, and I guess Barry's an author. And, but that's all good and well, but some things just don't change. Edna St. Vincent Millay said that a person who publishes a book willfully appears before the populace with his pants down. If it's a good book, nothing can hurt him. If it's a bad one, nothing can help him. Well, I'm happy to report that the reviews so far for At the Hands of Others, whether they were sent by personal note or in conversation or posted, say that it's the best one yet, best of the three, keep writing, great characters. So I gather that all in and I hold it close, and whether my pants are down or not, they give me some degree of cover and dignity. Whenever I have an opportunity to speak, I try not to be redundant. Sharon has heard some of this, but there's one point I like to make each time I have the pleasure of an audience. This new novel, like my past two, has a deep-rooted underlying statement. It's nothing I plan, it just seems to repeatedly evolve, and it rises to the surface in my work. Characters, often with a life-changing challenge, realize and embrace the value of community. Not their town or their city, but the community of our fellow man. To some degree, we're all individuals, but in the larger picture, we're merely threads in an intricately woven fabric that makes up a community of mankind. Inevitably, we engage with this community, sometimes with vigor, and sometimes with reluctance, but always we engage. This finds its way, inevitably, always in my writing. And like I said, I don't plan it. I embrace it when I see it, but it just is there as part of an innate part of my writing. Herman Melville said, "We cannot live only for ourselves. 1,000 fibers connect us with our fellow men." And I think that touches on the same thing. In each of my books, I started including a note from the author, and I touch on that in each one of them. And although I haven't fully identified it yet in the current piece that I'm working on, which is called Survive or Die Trying, which is a current work in progress, I expect it's going to surface there as well. I'm fortunate to have lived a life of a lot of varied experiences all over the world. First as the son of a naval officer, and then experiences that became the essentials of my survival when I left home at 16, and certainly as a combat Marine in Vietnam. Those woven into the life of a husband, a father, and a self-employed businessman never left me without something to be thinking about. This, of course, influenced my writing, but most important has been my constant eye to human nature and human interaction. Audiences quite often seem to enjoy the writer's process. So let's take a look at my process, which Sharon was relating to. Two questions most often asked are, why do you write? And how do I write? Well, Charlotte Bronte said, I'm just going to write because I can't help it. I tend to modify that and paraphrase it a bit. My answer is, when asked, I write because I am, and I am because I write. And that sounds a bit lofty, but I'm more me when I'm writing than I am at any other time. If you think about it, writing is actually somewhat magical, as is reading. They allow us to be whatever or whomever we want. We can travel near and far. We can be rich or poor, tall or short. We can be an astronaut or a rock star. And stories are an endless journey. Cornelia Funke, who writes children's books from Germany, said stories never really end. Even if the books like to pretend they do, stories always go on. They don't end on the last page any more than they begin on the first page. And I feel that that's true when I write my books, because I continue thinking about my characters on and on. But I also have one of the most common comments that comes from people is, are you going to tell us more about what Jonathan did? Are you going to tell us more about what Jack did? So the story's going on in their minds too, and that's one of my measurements of, okay, I hit something. How one writes probably has as many answers as there are writers. I don't outline. Many, and maybe even most, do. I want to be surprised and intrigued as the story moves on, as my characters and my readers are. It would be boring if I knew ahead exactly what was going to happen. Generally, I create a character and see what they do. And I'll paraphrase William Faulkner where he says, I create a character and then I run like hell beside them with a pencil and paper, writing down what they do and say. Stephen King says that all stories are like fossils, and we writers just dig them up. I rather like the comparison to carving an elephant by getting a very large stone and chipping away everything that doesn't look like an elephant. I find writing similar. Fossil or not, it's one big chunk-up idea that you chip away, and pretty soon you find the story. Some of my first feedback comes from my first readers, and they're spread across the country. They range from anywhere from 5 to 6 of them at any given time. And they only have one instruction, is don't be nice or kind, just be honest. And they give me their feedback, this works, doesn't work, it's not believable, even stuff that's historically wrong. In My Father's Shadow, there's a number of scenes at the Museum of Fine Art in Boston, and I had people turn in where they would have walked into a wall if they really walked that way, so I got that all corrected. I had plants that didn't exist at the museum, and I had people getting on an elevator that was a bathroom, so I got that all corrected. And I had people who, in the story, it was crucial that they stopped now and had a cup of coffee because it just the conversation required it. Well, there wasn't any place for coffee with them, so I didn't. But that's one of the big things. I had one of my new first readers in this current book talks about the Lone Ranger in Tonto, and I had put high ho silver, and it's really high yo silver. And so I got corrected on that. There was questions about whether or not you could really buy a Stetson for $59. And she finally decided if I wear a Stetson, I probably know whether you can. And so it's always interesting. My own father, who has since passed away, but he was well in his 90s when he read one of my books. And he took issue with me on iced tea or iced tea. He took issues with me on 60s IES or 60s YS in the period of time, not the period of your age. And I thought I was just sharing it with him because he was getting old and I didn't know if he was going to be able to read one or not. He sent back my manuscript with numbers all down through it and a page over here that referred to what I was supposed to read that I had fouled up on. And so you get them. And he was a first reader, but it was also sort of, here, Dad, read this in case something happens. And after that, I have a manuscript consultant. I call her that because she wouldn't let me call her editor. She likes manuscript consultant. She gets it, and she comes back, and she's honest, but she's sort of kind and gentle. She's a writer herself, and she feels that all writers are thin-skinned, which to some degree that's true. But and then the most important are my readers. I write the stories, I try to make them the best I can, but in the end it's up to you to let me know. I think that the most rewarding is that each audience is fun, and I leave each audience with some kind of special moment. And there was a time, it actually was at the Yarn Cellar, a young woman who had been somewhat shy and standoffish in the audience came up to me and stopped me at the door, and she said some other 3 children, she didn't have much time to read, but now she was anxious to read all 3 of my books. And another woman there, Yvette, she'd been looking at the images on the books, and I have a hat on and all of them. And she wanted to know if she could see my hat collection. And then the third one wanted to know if I thought her husband would enjoy my other books. And we had a fun discussion, and he asked about her husband a little bit, and we decided he would. And so that's basically who I am and what I do. I continued to write since I can read. Since somebody said to me at one book event, "When did you start writing?" And I said, "Well, didn't everybody's mother pin something up on the refrigerator that you wrote, in school?" Which, I don't know if that's true or not, but it worked for the occasion. Let me just tell you a little bit about the 3 books. The Middle of Nowhere was the first one that came out. And it's about 2 men coming from opposite sides of the country, both leaving a situation that has gone poorly. One's a marriage that went poorly. Another one is a marriage where the wife had died in a bad accident. And they meet in the middle of Kansas, in the middle of nowhere. And they're both a little bit cocky, a little bit high-strung, think they don't need anybody in the world, and they find out how much they need each other. There's an event in it, it's sort of the catalyst that throws them together and makes them understand that. They're very memorable characters. One of the things about doing a talk like this is I can be working along, I told you I'm a contractor, I can be hammering something or sawing something at the chop saw, and all of a sudden I find myself thinking about one of my characters. And I, oh, that's a character, that's, you wonder how Jonathan is or how Jax is. And so when I get an opportunity to come and visit a group like yourselves, it's like old home week and visit my own people again, and see how they're doing and hoping they're all right. And I do find myself sometimes reminding myself that the person I'm thinking about is a character. That really, I made him up, I mean, the beauty of being a writer is you sort of have a license to be a liar. You can make up whatever you want. And In My Father's Shadow is a book, takes place partly in Boston, partly in Maine. It's about a young girl around 32 years old who grew up spending her summers in Cushing, Maine, and went to Bowdoin, ended up down in Boston as working for a publishing firm. But ultimately some things happen and she realizes that her real roots are back in Maine. And so it's a journey of discovery that Anne goes through to find her way back to the people that are most important to her, the history that's most important to her, and the place that's most important to her, which is Cushing, Maine. And I don't tell a lot of people this, not for any other reason, it just doesn't come up, but this is actually the first book I wrote. And I couldn't get totally happy with it. And I worked on it and worked on it, and finally I said, okay, that's the first one, that's a good exercise, and I put it away. And it stayed put away, well, basically on the computer. I mean, so it's on the shelf in that sense. And I started writing The Middle of Nowhere. And The Middle of Nowhere went more quickly to a place where I was happy, and I published it first. And then I went back, I pulled this out, spent a year, probably a year, editing and revising the story and changing some things, and published that. And so, in a sense, this is the book that appeared date-wise first, and this is the one that appeared second, but this one was actually written first. At the Hands of Others is the story of Jonathan, and as the jacket blurb tells you about, Jonathan finds himself in the middle of the Maine woods up near Holton. He doesn't know how he got there. He doesn't know what has happened to him. He just knows that he's sort of dressed in hiking clothes. He's got this kind of irritation about his face, and then all of a sudden he realizes he doesn't know who he is. And so the story At the Hands of Others is his journey to finding himself, both literally who he is, and finding a much deeper part of himself. And this happens with the help he gets along the way, hence the title, At the Hands of Others. And his survival is at the hands of others. He does it by deciding that something has been done to him. He needs to find out what has happened to him, but he doesn't know, he doesn't want to necessarily reveal it because he doesn't know if the bad guys are right around the corner, they're coming back, what's going to happen. So he plans this process by where he's going to move slowly forward, and he doesn't even know really where he is. He doesn't know what state he's in or anything. And he's trying to find himself, but find out who he is without revealing that this has happened to him. And the greatest part of the story is the people he encounters. And one of the most important characters in the story is a man named Togue, who's a Native American, lives up in Holton, raised llama and sheep, and they become very good friends, and Togue becomes the conduit to get him back into finding himself and accepting who he is regardless of who he is. And because Jonathan is fearful at times. What if I'm not a good man? What if I was a bad man when I find myself? And so they work on this together. And there's a whole bunch of other people that come into play, including a police officer. And it's a network of people, which goes back to what I said earlier about it being a many threads of a fabric. And for those of you, I don't know how many read that blurb, but basically, as I said, we find Jonathan in the woods. The book starts that way. And He's trying to figure out what he's going to do. It's early in the afternoon, but there seems to be a storm coming, so he starts moving out of the woods to try to find what is. So I'll read from the book, and then we can discuss it if you'd like, or any questions. So I'm picking up right when Jonathan has come out of the woods. And he's left the place where he found him. The only thing there is his glasses, which are set up on a stump, and himself and nothing else. On the opposite side of the road, a sign hung from a tree, and Jonathan scrambled up the embankment and crossed. The sign hung from hammered iron hooks and had the name Haskell printed in dark green block letters. John made his way down the drive and passed by a low wet area where cat-o'-nine-tails, buttercups, and other wildflowers. And he came upon a small cabin with its back tucked into the trees. A small porch sat one step up from the moss and lichen-covered ledge and made up the front foundation. A yellow old-town canoe rested lashed to two sawhorses, and a long woodpile covered with a brown tarp ran alongside it. Shutters covered the front windows, and a solid door hung between a green screen door detailed with 3 small corners carved into it. At one side, a wood box backed up under the shuttered windows, and at the other, 2 rocking chairs sat in waiting, both securely attached to the cabin with a chain and a hook on each. Jonathan sat in the second chair and rocked for a minute. He felt a sense of warmth and familiarity, and turned to look again at the yellow canoe, the log pile, and the roadway. He tried, but he couldn't bring anything into focus. Everything fluttered by in blurred motion like when the film goes bad in a movie theater. At one of the windows, he slid the boards out of the yokes and secured the shutters and swung each back. Large cumulus clouds that had hung low were growing in height and rolling across the sky, and the changing air brought a coolness that chilled him. The cabin offered shelter and maybe food. Jonathan took his Gerber knife from his pocket and opened it. He carefully dug the putty until little retainers holding the glass were revealed, and these he removed one by one and stuck them in the putty of the adjacent pane. He pried the glass left and right from the wood frame until it came free. With the pane of glass set against the cabin wall, he reached in until he could unlatch the window's lock. The window slid up with little resistance, and Jonathan hooked one leg over the sill, and then pivoted his back under the sash and pulled his other leg through, taking care not to damage anything. He found a pad of paper with an advertisement from a drug company, and an earthen vase with pencils. He looked through papers and pamphlets on a side table, hoping to find something with an address, anything that might reveal where he was, but he found nothing. After a meal fashioned from canned goods, Jonathan defeated his hunger, but as the curtains closed on a disturbing day, the demons inside continued to boil. With a fleece blanket he found over the back of a chair, he curled up on the couch and tried to sleep. He didn't think he had fallen asleep, but awoke in a start, tangled in the blanket and fighting to break free. He sat up, chilled by his sweat-soaked shirt, and wrapped the blanket around his shoulders. Outside, remnants of the evening shower made echoing plop sounds as drops fell from the trees onto the covered wood and upturned canoe. Jonathan trembled and tried to shake free the dream that had woken him. Faces swirling in front of him, the mouths gaping and moving like goldfish in a fishbowl, and they made no sound, and then they merged into one another until a single mouth opened and closed as if speaking or crying or gasping. In the haze of his dream, something pulled him backward, and a curtain fell across his face, and all went dark. As he sat there, rocking back and forth, the small volcanoes inside erupted, and the molten lava and fear and longing burst forth, trampling his attempts to stay calm. He rose from the couch, taking the green fleece with him, and went to where he had left out a jug of bottled water. He drank from the jug and then stripped off his wet shirt and washed his face. He took the tattered fleece from the pegs and hung his shirt over the chair to dry. Back on the couch, he took several deep breaths and pulled the blanket up under his chin. His fist clenched the blanket tight to his neck, and he tried to remember anything. In the darkness, images spun by in rapid fire motion, dissolving into each other but never becoming clear or meaningful. The depth of aloneness, compounded with not knowing, left him trembling. Jonathan was up early to a morning clearing and surrendering itself to the natural sounds of the forest, with only lingering drops falling as the leaves warmed. He shook off the last of sleep's haze and the undefinable remnants of dreams that sat for a moment on the edge of the couch, quickly recognizing the cabin. He did not know who he was or how this all happened to him, but he knew in spite of his anxiety, apprehension, and shadows of fear, control, not panic, must prevail. Still, he listened carefully for any sound. He walked from window to window, and from a position hidden to the side looked out, scanning the tree line and surrounding area, having stopped not far from where he found himself. Certainly anyone looking for him would come to the Haskell cabin, and of course the owners could arrive at any time. He opened the door and looked out and listened. Convinced all was quiet and safe, he went back inside. With everything back in proper order, he made his way outside, where he fitted the pane of glass back into its frame. The overnight rain left the morning cool, and he put the fleece on and positioned the hat on his head. It fit well, and this pleased him. At the highway, Jonathan looked both ways. Crossing the road didn't seem necessary, so he turned right and headed north, with a plan of sorts and feeling a little more in control. He felt good, and he rubbed the stubble on his face and wished he had shaved. The highway ran straight as far as he could see, and in a short while a dark burgundy trailer truck came from the north. As it passed, Jonathan read Hannaford on the side. Hannaford, he thought. For a second it sounded familiar, but it was fleeting. A half hour passed before he heard the sound of another truck coming from the south. Jonathan turned and held out his thumb. The truck began to slow from some distance away, and as it neared Jonathan, it continued past and rolled to a stop. The truck glistened as though it were brand new. The cab, a deep forest green, had gold letters on the door, Stillman Transport, and under that, Holton, Maine. Jonathan grabbed the chrome assist bar and stepped up and opened the door. The driver, a small man, almost dwarfed by the size of his truck's cab, smiled across at Jonathan. He wore khaki pants and a yellow shirt with button-down pocket flaps. A pair of sunglasses dangled on a cord around his neck, and his hair, brown and wavy, was combed as if he had just come from church. "Morning, friend. Hop aboard." The driver extended a hand as Jonathan settled into the seat and reached for a seatbelt. "Brad Stillman. And you are?" "Jonathan." "Jonathan Ford," Jonathan said, quickly remembering the Hannah Ford truck that went by. "So where are you headed, Jonathan Ford?" Comforted by the sound of another voice, Jonathan felt layers of his concern peel off like the skin of an onion. He looked across the wide console at Brad Stillman and he smiled. "Headed? That damn road is so lonely you almost forget where you're headed or where you came from. You damn near forget who you are out there." A lot's been said about the stretch of highway, and I think you may have just summed it up. "Is that today's paper?" Jonathan asked. "No, it's yesterday's Portland Press Herald." The driver reached behind the console. "Here, this morning's Bangor Daily News, fresh off the press." Jonathan read the top header, Bangor, Maine, May 18th, 2012. Again, something seemed familiar, but it dissipated like a small puff of smoke. Jonathan scanned the pages for anything he might recognize. He looked for a story on a missing person or anything else that might suggest he's being missing. Politics, economics, and pretty much a mixture of life in Maine played out across each page. Brad looked down at Jonathan's pack, his stick, and then up at him. He says, "Hiking? Camping?" "A little of both. Trying to stay away from the camping part, but seems to be quite a bit of hiking. I got a bit of a project going." Jonathan pulled on the belt that crossed his chest and turned slightly in the seat. Another big truck passed by heading south, and the truck rocked slightly. "I'm writing a story. It's sort of a documentary about traveling lonesome highways. It's supposed to be a minimalistic venture with no money and few supplies. The intent is to see how far you can successfully make it on the highway, working as need be, and finding shelter where you can. I pitched the idea to a couple of magazines and got some bites." The driver downshifted as they approached a curve. "You're kidding. You mean to tell me you're headed north on this road, not knowing where you will sleep next, and you don't have any money?" "Damn crazy if you ask me." The driver shook his head. "Sure is, and you just became a character in my story. You mind if I use your name?" Brad Stillman gave Jonathan a thumbs up. "Be my guest." The morning sun filtered down on the highway, and once in a while a car or a pickup passed, heading south to Bangor, Jonathan assumed. "Tell you what, there's a good stop a ways ahead," Brad said. "I'll buy you a coffee and breakfast, too, if you'd like." "I'd like that very much," he was Jonathan's first encounter with another person when he realized that he didn't know who he was. I don't want to tell you too much, but one of the things that happened to Jonathan is basically some young kids thought that they would accost this man and make him go to an ATM and take money out or something. And they had this drug that they had stolen. And unfortunately, they didn't know how to use it or whatever, so they sort of overdosed Jonathan. He collapsed. They didn't know what to do with him, so they dumped him in the woods. And they took off. And they were just sort of, well, one of them's a lowlife. The other one's just sort of the victim of the other one. So that's how it happens. And then as we continue, Jonathan continues to meet people through Brad that helps him find his way and keeps him safe. And eventually a turnout that's both good for him and hopefully good for the readers. So I'm happy for any questions or thoughts or about anything I've said, the books, this book.
I have a question, Barry.
Yes.
Why didn't he go to cops? Why didn't he go right, I mean, to the police? The first thing I would have done.
In the beginning of the book, he discusses that, and he figures that they're just going to think he's crazy when he says he doesn't know who he is or anything. So he's more concerned at the beginning with, are these people just around the corner? Are they watching him? Are they going to come back and finish what they started? So he's carefully trying to find out who he is without revealing who he is in that way.
Right.
Another question that actually comes up in the book, and it came up in the book because I think it might have been my manuscript consultant we were talking about it, about a silver alert. It's Jonathan 72 or so. And a silver alert obviously is when a senior citizen goes missing. Usually they have some kind of other issue. So you can post a silver alert. And another person who gets very involved in this story is Ann Valancourt, who's the chief of police in this area, which is a township. It's not a town up near Holton. And I had to do a little research on this because she can only go so far with her jurisdiction before the state police would get involved anyway. And so I had to make sure that this is realistic, whether or not you bring the state police in, because she didn't, as she's trying to find Jonathan, want to scare him away, so she wants to do it gently and sort of merge this thing in. And the whole story follows that line of how she does this as she goes up the highway towards Holton, leaving these flyers. And I think you read the book, so you remember one of the flyers becomes a very crucial catalyst in something that happens.
Yeah.
And I guess I can tell a little bit that the flyer becomes damaged so that people who see the flyer are not getting the whole story, and all of a sudden Brad thinks that he's taken a person that's bad and introduced him to Togue and put him in danger. And so that is played out in a fairly dramatic scene that involves a wounded bear. If you read the book, you'll find that Togue's personality is so distinct and so different than anybody else in the books. And the Native American part of it is highly researched to be accurate. Even where he lives, west of Holton, is accurate as to what tribe lived there. His name is accurate. He had a twin brother, which we accurately named him. So I'll start doing those things, and then other things will spin off of it. And just to give you an idea how something will jump up, and I'll sometimes I don't realize that I've done it, and I'll look back and I say, oh, that's a good thing. I'll play with that a bit. But when I said that Togue had to raise sheep and llamas, I didn't know whether you could really raise sheep and llamas together. So I said, well, it's kind of interesting. I wonder if you can. So I started researching. Well, actually, it's done a lot, because the llama is like a sentry, and their eyes are on the side of their heads. So, which is pretty common with an animal that can be a prey, because he watches from the sides, where a predator has his eyes on the front of his head, like a bear. So I would research the llama, and it turns out that the llamas are actually used by sheep herders sometimes to be sentries for the sheep. And not even a coyote will mess with a llama when that comes down on them. So in doing the research for that and finding the tribes that lived west of Holton and on the Metawaskek River, I started getting a feel of and then I'll get, just characters, you know, where Toad's very, very witty, and so is Jonathan, so they're constantly playing word games back. He uses a couple of techniques to find his way out of the woods. He knows how to use his watch for a compass. He has no compass, but he knows how to use his watch to determine north-south and east-west. And he knows that he's walking along a river that, you know, more often than not, rivers will run to civilization, so he's trying to get at least to a road, which he does get to a road. He's very reluctant to break into this cabin and violate these people's property, but he knows you know, the storm's coming. He needs food. He needs shelter. He's got on I think he has on khaki shorts and a blue tech shirt and hiking boots. And when he was sort of taken by these guys, he had just gone out for a walk, which is the walk he normally does in the morning. And he and his wife are getting ready. This is a cabin that they were opening up for the season. They were getting ready to go back home, which was more southern part of Maine. And he just didn't come home. And then she reported it to the police, and then you have to go through this, you know, is there a 24-hour waiting period before somebody's really missing and all this type of stuff. This story here is kind of interesting because it's written. This is written in the present tense, and it's written from the point of view of a 32-year-old young woman. So the voice is always in that young woman's voice. And at the time, my daughters were, well, they were a little over 32, and you know, obviously I was tapping into that a little bit, and so I could get sort of the language and different things, and but the sensitivities of what she was dealing with as she goes through this sort of journey of discovery was all from the viewpoint of a young woman, including personal and intimate relationships with men. I'm still writing it from the woman's perspective, which was fun. It was interesting and challenging at times. But when I was at the University of Southern Maine, one of my writing professors pulled me aside. It was before class, and I forget what the assignment had been, and I had turned in this paper, and she said, I want to say something to you, but I don't want to offend you. And again, you know, just coming from a Gunkwit sometimes has this little extra baggage that people think you carry, which you really don't. She says, I don't know how to say this to you, but you have a unique ability to write in the voice of a woman. I said, well, you haven't offended me at all. I think you just complimented me. You know? And it was fun. It was challenging.
Who are some of your favorite authors? I mean, it sounds like you've read a lot of existential work when you were younger. You know, like Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
One of my favorite authors was Ernest Hemingway. And when I was returned to college, I read so much in a week. The assignments, I would be reading 2 or 3 novels in a week. And sometimes they were old stuff, because I really liked the 18th century and the Romantic period and Coleridge and Wordsworth and all that. So we're reading stuff that sometimes is on yellowed paper or is being mimeographed from old manuscripts and stuff. So it was difficult reading, but it was a lot of reading. And then we would have to write analysis of them. Sometimes it was a theory paper where we were taking it apart theoretically. And all of a sudden, when I got my degree and I'm sitting home and I'm saying to myself, geez, you know, I'm not reading anything, you know. So I thought, well, I got to get reading again. So I immediately thought, well, I got to read Romantic or, you know, 18th century women. I took a course that was it was a paired regular English course and a women's study course, because it was all about 18th century women writers. So Mary Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft, and that whole group there. My younger years were influenced by the fact that I left home when I was 16. And the first thing I had to do was get a job, support myself. And my father was a Navy officer. We were stationed in Virginia at the time, and I took off in the middle of the night and came to first Massachusetts, then Maine. And pulled it off. You know, I did get a job, and I finagled my way into finished the last 2 years of high school over in Wells. And that was interesting because I didn't have parents, and therefore I should be paying tuition, and I didn't have any money. So I let them think that somebody was a guardian, which got by them. So anyway, I spent a lot of time working and you know, facilitating a life that was going to work, and didn't do a lot of things. I never got involved in sports because I never had time. I was right after school. I had to support myself. So I didn't do the kind of reading that you would have thought in my younger years. When I graduated high school, I went to Suffolk University in Boston, and I wanted to be a journalist. I was dating my wife, and I was trying to go to college with nobody footing the bills. And it just wasn't working out too well. Suffolk's an on-campus college, so I had an apartment down in Cleveland Circle. And so I decided to take a semester off and work. Well, that didn't go over too well with the government because I lost my school deferment, and they told me I was going to go in the Army. And I said, no, I'm not going in the Army. I went to the Marine Corps, and they decided to send me on vacation to Southeast Asia, and I stayed over there for a while. And then when I came back, I went back to college. I tried to go back to college on the GI Bill. I was married at that point. We didn't have any children or anything, and the GI Bill really wasn't enough to pull it off. So I started my own business back in 1971 and been self-employed ever since. And like I said, I've always written, but I wasn't really able to concentrate on it until you got rid of, you know, some of the debt, the mortgages, putting my kids through college and stuff, and then I was able to say, okay, my favorite little line, the emancipation from the slavery of debt.
Have you always thought of yourself as a writer, though, through all those
Yes.
years?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's how you see
I used to write. I wrote short stories a lot. I wrote a lot of short stories, both at the university. I wrote short stories when I was pretty young. I wrote poetry mostly during the 60s, and pre-Vietnam and post-Vietnam, I wrote poems that reflected both of those periods. And but yes, I always thought, you know, I think I would have if you'd asked me when I was 16, what do you want to be when you grow up? I published a book of poetry in 73 or so. Most of those have been written on pieces of cardboard boxes and stuff. So.
But it was published.
Excuse me?
It was published.
Yeah, yeah, that was published in 73. That was just it was called From Within. It was a series of, actually what it was the pre-Vietnam and the post-Vietnam poetry,
Ooh.
and then some essays that just were more thought-provoking, almost generated by what was going on with the Vietnam War and politics at the time, and kind of the question authority thing that was going on in the 60s.
How did you survive at 16 on your own, as far as like a place to stay? Did you know people to stay with, or?
I did it kind of layered. My sister and my brother-in-law were living in Nagunquit at the time. So when I came up that summer, I didn't really live with them. I rented a cabin at one of these, called Ocean Overlook. It was up near where Hannaford is in Wells now, right across the street. And I don't know, I paid a little bit of money and I had this little cabin. So I did that. And when school started, I rented this, it was like the widow's walk of this building. What's there now? It's across from Jake's in Moody. It's not there now. And, you know, I was going to school, and this is problematic if the school found out, you know, because it really wasn't great to have a 16, 17-year-old, you know, running kind of wild like I was. And, but, I don't know, sometime that winter or something, I just was really getting lonesome. So I went and stayed with my sister and brother-in-law for that part of that year. And then I moved out in the summer and back to that kind of game I was playing. So it was that, and then I worked to you know, always pay the bills. I had two jobs generally. Like I was working for where Cornerstone Pizza is in Nagunquit now. It used to be Lee's Gulf Station, and I worked for Lee Colton. And then there was a grocery store there. It wasn't A&P at the time, and I had negotiated a part-time job with that. So I put these different things together all managed to put two or three things together to pull it off.
So you didn't have any trouble having your character kind of get by with very little?
No, and I think a certain ability to be innovative comes into the characters too. All of these guys, whether it's Jonathan, Ann's friend, in her story, they're all very capable, clever, kind of a MacGyverish, and able to figure out how to do something. Yes?
How much time do you spend, would you say, percentage-wise, writing, editing, and researching? Are they all equal?
No, they're not equal.
Yeah.
First, I like to use it's actually a sewing term, I don't know what the term is, but you know, you backstitch, you stitch and you backstitch and go like that. My mother was a seamstress, but I still don't know what it's called. So when I write, that's how I edit sometimes. And when I start the day, I can never just leave what I wrote the day before without taking another look. So I'm constantly editing as I go. And I don't write, some writers say, okay, I gotta write for the first 2 hours from 8 to 10 every morning. I write by the word count. And I'll set a word count that I have to do 1,000 words today, and if it takes me all day, I'm not done until I've done 1,000 words. If I happen to do it in an hour because it's really going well, then you know I've met my goal. Doesn't mean I might not go beyond, but I have to meet that. If I have a dentist appointment and I'm at 500 words, then I have to do 1,500 the next day. I've got to recover that 500. And that doesn't mean that it's always 1,000 good words. It's 1,000 words of raw material that you can now, like the elephant, chip away and find the story. And I've had false starts that don't go. In fact, this book started from, I don't believe in writer's block, because I always wonder what would happen if a brain surgeon had surgeon's block. How can I have writer's block? I just have to figure out a way past the stumbling. So I used to have this little game I played with myself where I'd write starters. And I would sit down and I would just give myself a certain amount of time. First thing that came to my mind, I'd just write about. The gentleman sitting in front of me with a blue striped shirt, he had on khaki pants and a nice pair of black shoes. And then I'll go from there. Then the metaphors and the analogies come into it. And I may keep that enough, but what it did is it made me write something. This book started from one of those starters. It's not the original draft, it was the first chapter, but it's like the 5th chapter or something. And Jonathan's story, At the Hands of Others, actually started from a joke. And the joke is that all stories have a beginning, middle, and an end. And this book starts with, I can't tell you the beginning, I can tell you the middle, but I don't know the end. And it started out called I Am, the letter I, and then AM, which meant I am, but it also meant it's about me. And it then got changed to, I don't know, somewhere in the writing process it became At the Hands of Others, because I started to see what was happening. But it started as a game, probably, because I wasn't writing anything in particular. So I'll spend, my writing amount of time depends on the word count. The editing can be ongoing, but then it's very extensive after the first draft. And I go word by word, page by page, throw stuff away, make page 5 become page 15, and do a lot of, I mean, some of this stuff's easier with computers now because you can cut and paste stuff. I literally, when I first started writing, I literally cut things out and pasted it in another place on the manuscript. And then I didn't know how to type, so I gave it to someone else to type. And but another little interesting anecdote about this. I had a computer crash right in the middle of this book, and I had a what do you call it, a hard drive that's not part of the computer, disconnected. And no, it was called Maxor. It was supposed to be backing up my computer at 8 o'clock every morning. I assumed it was. It didn't tell me it wasn't. And when the computer crashed, I went to that to recover a lot of stuff, including this novel. And I was not able to. It didn't work. So fortunately, I had sent, when I send them out to first readers, I actually prepare them in a 3-ring binder and I mail them to them. So they have a hard copy of this novel at different stages. Because if you were a first reader and yours has come back and I've input things that I agree with or whatever, and then I've sent it to you, it's a little different version. So I rebuilt this novel from the last first reader's copy. And I tried to hire some young girls that were in college or whatever to type it for me, because I don't really know how to type. I mean, I type, but I don't, like, you know, sitting down typing from a hard copy, 200 pages was more than I wanted to do. But I did, and I was afraid, and I was scared, because I thought, oh, all my good stuff's gonna go. You know, I'm not gonna be able to, you know, I'm not gonna get it all, because it's different versions. Well, the fact is, it was kind of a great editing process, because it's sort of, Hemingway used to say that all good stories have to sit on the drain board at night, and the bad stuff will drain off. To paraphrase, but basically. And that's what had happened, and I ended up feeling that it was a much stronger story in places where it had been weak. Whether the whole story is strong, I'm not sure, but there were weak areas that got strengthened because I got distance from it. So that was a forced editing that I had not planned on. I don't ever want to do it again. When you create something, and certainly people, you do get quite intimately involved with them, and so you worry about them, and you don't want to lose them, and it's kind of fun that, I mean, I still live with all these people.
When's the next one coming out?
I thought it might be out late this year, but I don't think it's going to. It's, just give you a little bit story about Survive or Die Trying. Without getting too far, it's about two Marines, and it's 40 years after an incident in Vietnam, and one Marine has died, and this other Marine gets a package in the mail. And the Marine that has died wants him to take care of some things in this package. And the play on the title, Survive or Die Trying, is that when you go to war, you survive or you die trying. But sometimes when you come back from war, you still might die trying to survive. And this is the case between these two Marines. The guy that died, he just died of, he was in his 60s, I forget, I think he has, I don't think I tell you what he has, but it's suggestive enough to be a disease that we all, like cancer or something like that. And he has spent most of his life trying to erase this incident that took place in Vietnam. And he's done this, this, and this. And he wants Charles, whose nickname is Checkmate, because everybody had a nickname in Vietnam, and he was a chess player, and he always won, so he's called Checkmate. And he wanted him to continue this issue. And Charles is not happy about this. You know, why are you making me relive this or that? I can write it fairly accurately because I was a combat Marine in Vietnam, and I ran a unit, and I played on that a bit. It can be tough at times because it takes me, this is 40 some odd years ago, this is 40, almost 50 years ago since I was in Vietnam. And, but it takes you back remarkably fast, much more than I even thought it would at times. And the story is intricate, and when will it come out? It's snagged, how's that? The story's good, I love my characters, but it needs to flip-flop. There's too much introspective discussion at the beginning right now, and I'm not engaging the reader with someone else, so that can't work. And I recognize that, and my manuscript consultant has recognized it, and I'm reluctant to give up a couple things that I like it the way it is. So I have to figure out a way to bridge what I think is correct. And Joan, my manuscript, agrees, my wife agrees. I don't totally agree that this has to change, I just feel that somehow I have to bridge that missing piece. And I will admit I had to back off on one part of it because it got too close, and I had to decide, okay, maybe I want to go a different direction with this, or take a deep breath and, you know, suck it up. I mean, I was reading something the other day, can't remember who said it, but something to the effect that a novelist's job is to find the dirtiest things in the world and then make you shake when you read them. So that's a paraphrase, but and there's some truth to that. You know, I mean, good novels can really provoke thinking that is important.